Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Nine Inch Nails has always been interesting to me. It was the first time I'd ever heard of a band that was actually just one person playing all the parts, and the music Trent Reznor was able to make when he had that sort of creative control was really different from anything else I'd heard, so today I thought I'd look at one of my favorite of his songs, Hurt. Now, there's not many good transcriptions of this song out there, but as far as I can tell, it starts like this. And if you're like me, these immediately look like arpeggios. This is when you play the notes of a chord one at a time instead of all at once, and in order to analyze it, we just have to condense them back into their complete chords. If we do that here, we get this. And that's where things start to get complicated, because those aren't chords. I mean, they are, but they're not normal ones. So what's going on? Well, I think we need to break this into two parts. He starts each of them with what's called a power chord, which consists of two notes, the root and the fifth. These are the foundations of the harmony here, and if we isolate them, we get a cool, bluesy progression reminiscent of songs like Smoke on the Water. This gives the section a solid backbone and makes it feel pretty recognizable, even with all the other weirdness going on. Anyway, power chords are a really strong, stable sound, but they're also kind of empty. They don't bring a lot of emotion to the table, which is where the other notes come in. If this were a normal song, we might expect to hear something like this. But Reznor wants more dissonance, so over the first power chord he plays this, a tritone. Tritones are a pretty unstable interval all on their own, but he also just played an F sharp, so the F natural here rubs against that too. It's like a bait and switch. He promised us a normal chord, and then at the last second, he took it away. It's also worth mentioning that he sometimes adds a D natural as well, which honestly doesn't change much. It makes this a B minor triad, but the sound is still dominated by that wild tritone. For the next two chords, he plays this, and this, and once the rhythm's stripped away, it's clear that these are just the same notes both times. In fact, those notes, D and E, are the roots of the two power chords they're played over, and if we put the rhythm back, we see that he's always playing the root of the current chord first. This honestly doesn't even feel harmonic to me. It's more like a melody tying the two chords together with a shared figure. I've seen people analyze these with weird names in order to include both notes, but I think they're best viewed as just decorated power chords. After a while, this gives way to the pre-chorus, where we start seeing full chords, although they're still pretty unusual. Well, mostly. The first one's easy. All we've got is A's and E's, making this an A power chord, or A5. The second one looks like some kind of B chord. We've got B, E, F sharp, and A, giving us a B7 sus4, which is like a normal B minor 7, but the third degree D has been replaced with a fourth degree E. This gives it a hanging suspended feel, and it wants to fall back down to B minor 7, but Reznor doesn't let it. Instead, we move to the third chord, which has G, A, D, and E. Ignoring the E for a moment, this looks like a G sus2 chord, which is like the sus4 we just saw, except we replace the third degree with a second instead of the fourth. It behaves similarly, and we'd expect it to resolve to G major, although as you might have guessed, it doesn't actually do that. Circling back to the E though, this is the sixth degree. This is a common jazz decoration, giving the chord a bit more color without changing much about its function. And finally we have this, which is D major with an added E, again serving as decoration. This sets up a return to the start of the progression with what's called a plagal cadence, where the 4 chord resolves to the 1. It's a little weaker than a typical 5-1 resolution, which helps prevent any real sense of finality. That's one way to look at the section anyway, and having researched this, it's one that seems pretty common, but I think there's a simpler explanation. Let's do what we did in the verse and split these chords up into two parts. On the first chord, we have a low A5 and a high A5. On the second one, we have a B5 and another A5. On the third one, we've got a G5 and, you guessed it, another A5. The fourth chord is a little trickier since it's a complete major triad, but if you look closely, it's still got that A5 again. This is what's called a pedal, where you keep playing the same note, or in this case notes, even as the harmony around it changes. The power chord is just a constant drone happening on top of whatever the actual chords are, and those chords are fairly straightforward. Ignoring the D major, which we explained earlier, we've got what amounts to a harmonic trill. We've got the 1 chord, the 2 chord, and the flat 7 chord. It's just circling around the root of the key, and it feels almost more like a melody, which isn't surprising since power chords by themselves don't really carry much harmonic weight. But there's one last elephant in the room. This section is clearly in the key of A, but wasn't the verse in B? Well, I'm not actually sure it was. The chords by themselves imply it, but the melody ends on an A and the section ends on an E chord, which would be the 5 chord in that key. I think the verse is purposefully ambiguous in its tonality, and it never actually goes to an A chord, but I don't think it's unreasonable to analyze it like that, which means we never actually changed keys. And that's pretty much it. There's a chorus, but as far as I can tell, the progression is basically the same as the pre-chorus except without the D major. But I can't talk about Hurt without mentioning Johnny Cash's version because it's one of the best covers I've ever heard. It's so good that Trent Reznor himself has publicly stated that the song doesn't belong to him anymore. It starts like this. And besides the new key, this is pretty similar to the original, but with some of the weirder notes removed. He keeps that up in the chorus, where our power chords have been filled out. He keeps the pedal but reduces it to one note and moves it to the piano, and I think that sort of simplicity is what makes the cover work. But the original is really heavily produced with static noise tracks, orchestration changes, and lots of digital processing. Cash strips it down to the bare essentials with just a guitar, a piano, and of course, his voice. He also speeds it up, makes the vocal rhythm much more conversational, and even changes the lyrics to fit the story he's trying to tell. Now, I'm not saying that Cash's version is better than Reznor's. Questions like that are outside the scope of this sort of analysis. They had different stylistic goals and they used the appropriate tools to accomplish them. But I think it's a perfect example of how to do a cover right. Cash identified the heart of the song, the part that gives it its identity and makes it work, and he changed everything else. What's left is a song that's clearly Hurt, but also not. It's very much its own piece of art, even if they were both painting the same thing. Anyway, thanks for watching, and thanks to Patreon patron Bryce Jabs for suggesting this song. If you'd like to see your favorite song analyzed, just head on over to Patreon and pledge at any level. You can also check out our store, join our mailing list, like, share, comment, subscribe, and keep on rockin'.